Hello, my name is Luke.
And my name is Piers.
And welcome to On the Gallery Floor, a new contemporary art podcast where artists and audiences get to interview each other.
Yes, artists answer your questions while getting to ask some of their own too.
By bringing you closer to the artist and the artist closer to you, we hope to transform contemporary art's reputation from an inaccessible conundrum into an ordinarily relatable experience for all.
So, get your questions ready and meet us on the gallery floor. In this episode, we're talking to the Southampton-based artist Julian Grater, whose exhibition, Arctic Mirage, is currently on show at Southampton City Art Gallery. Arctic Mirage is both an exhibition and an expedition, wherein Julian offers you the chance to retrace his journey across our planet's high Arctic. Through drawing, painting, and photography, you'll discover this fascinating region and Julian's fascination with it. Julian's ability to capture the presence of this otherworldly environment and its inhabitants is nothing short of astonishing. Glaciers, icebergs, Greenlandic Inuits, and sled dogs are all depicted in their respective medium with a surreal exactness and an enlightening sensitivity. His charcoal contours ice sheets, his oil paint settles like falling snow, his camera realises what is unreal. As you encounter Julian's subject, you'll find your reflection there too. Arctic Mirage is also a repository for your innermost feelings that, like the deep waters ferrying the region's ice, reveals ghostly duplicates of its surface counterpart. Together, these components make Arctic Mirage a must-see exhibition. You'll no doubt come to respect this remarkable region and recognise Julian as a contemporary master. Arctic Mirage is showing until the 3rd of February, 2024. Well, hello Julian, and thank you very much for joining us on the gallery floor today. It's our first episode outside of John Hansard Gallery, and we are in Southampton City Art Gallery. We are very excited. Thank you for coming, Julian.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
This is so great. And I wish you could see us, because Julian's got this wonderful lamp. It's like he's under interrogation. I think this is probably the best visuals that we've had so far. We've been cramped in screening rooms on the mezzanine before, but this is... You've gone 10 out of 10, Julian. So, well. Thank you for being here.
No, it's my pleasure.
So we've got some questions for you. You've got some questions for us, and our audience has questions too. Julian, are you ready?
I'm ready. Do fire away.
Let's get into it then.
So, Julian, our first question is, we know you work with drawing, photography, and painting. Can you explain to us how you manipulate a broad range of materials within your work?
I think I always think of myself as an artist who makes drawing first and foremost, and I think the rest of my practice sits upon that kind of engine or machine. And I think that I've always gravitated towards the work of other artists who perhaps use drawing as a primary principal medium within their own practice. But one of the things I should probably say is that I don't use drawings to imagistically or compositionally predetermine what might inform a painting eventually. So I would rarely work directly from one thing to the other. And I see my drawings very much as works in their own right. Having said that, I may very occasionally use or call upon kind of imagistic elements of drawing or photography to sometimes provide a basic kind of architecture for a painting. So I'll use drawings to perhaps test out the validity of an image, to see if it has any creative legs or longevity in my own imagination. And I think this is I think this is why I often work across these large, kind of crazily sort of extended, large series of works. But I have to feel like I'm truly kind of metabolizing an image into existence, if that makes sense. Otherwise, for me personally, it's like, what's the point? And I also think drawing provides this much more direct and immediate conduit to the brain, thought and imagination, and has the potential to be kind of energized and activated in a way that painting struggles sometimes to achieve, I think.
Why do you think it struggles?
I think painting's much more time interrupted in a sense, and it's, you know, you have that space between the palette and the canvas, and that's a space in which a lot of questioning and self-doubt and self-examination can kind of disrupt the process in a sense. So one has to figure out, you have to carefully kind of figure out different kinds of process strategies. I'm not saying that that's kind of necessarily a negative thing, but it does require a different set or repertoire of disciplines.
Yeah, for sure.
But I've always needed a very physical engagement with the notion of making work in whatever medium I'm working in. And this is very much a common ingredient. And I'm always looking out for ways to kind of sort of agitate and disrupt the form or the language that I'm working in. And I think visual artists or any creative individual is almost duty bound in a sense to kind of do that. Perhaps looking for unconventional ways of using the materials, for example, not solely for the sake of it, but to attempt at least to find a visual language informed by the thing that I'm interested in at the time. I'm also, of course, trying to find ways of keeping myself interested in what I'm doing, So for me personally, you know, these extensions or disruptions of the form and the language are kind of pivotal to the way I work. So, you know, I do like experimentation, and I like to try at least to keep myself on a kind of threshold between the known and the unknown. It's a kind of it's often a kind of uneasy, queasy kind of balancing act. Mm-hmm. But you use the word range in your question, and that seems like a very apposite word to me, actually, because there is a certain kind of leakage from one medium to another, and I guess I work in quite a kind of tightly scoped, porous, interconnected trilogy of mediums, each of which has its own set of specific and particular ingredients that I'm kind of very passionate about, and which offer me different levels of engagement with the element of time. Time is a big factor, whether it's the expression of something perhaps in the fraction of a second through the camera, or the expression of something through the sedimentation of time with paintings, for example, which might take me a long time to accomplish.
For sure. And like you were saying, with that time in between the palette and the canvas,
yeah,
I imagine there's so much, as brief as that moment of taking the paintbrush from the palette to the canvas might be, when you're drawing, and same with you, Piers, when you're drawing, you might also feel that you can make those quick adjustments to what it is that you're seeing, rather than, I don't know, you do something and then you look away to do the paint, and then you look back and maybe something's changed that you're looking at, or like even just the thoughts that you're having.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a much more immediate process. I mean, I do think that space between, you know, the palette deciding which colour to mix or which tone to mix, what consistency that might have, and the perhaps, you know, the doubt of and the indecision of where that might end up on the canvas is something that one permanently has to be aware of, I think, as a painter. so I do think drawing offers this much more, this much more immediate, the more immediate realization of a thought.
For sure.
I think. So I think over the years I've learned how to strategically subdivide my practice into these three principal disciplines, if you like, largely driven, I guess, by a kind of a sort of creative urgency or a necessity, or a particular kind of creative predicament that I might find myself in at the time. They each hold different material properties and require different creative approaches, and that's a facet to my practice that I really like and enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever just wake up one day and you think, "Ooh, I'm in a more painterly mood today," or?
Well, I mean, I certainly do, but I can wake up one morning, pick up a pencil, and it's as much as you can do to draw a circle. I mean, I think one has to kind of, as an artist or a maker, you're kind of in a permanent state of self-challenge. I think having to work through those very uncertain moments, and it's often. I mean, I can talk a bit more about biomarkers later on and the making of biomarkers, but actually I stopped painting for probably 4 or 5 years while I was making that body of work. Okay. And that was a kind of frustration of sorts, setting the painting element of my practice aside. But the flip side of the coin was that I had made the decision was sort of made for me in a sense from the information, the data that I was kind of looking at with regards to regards to those fossils and so on. Mm-hmm. And it had it needed to be realized in a very particular kind of language, which didn't involve painting at all.
You just knew going into it, I need this tool for the job, and painting just wasn't it.
Yeah.
No, that's good. And I imagine that just comes from a consistent use of said medium in your thing.
I mean, there's
its limitations.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. And it comes from a sort of creative imperative of the moment, I think.
For artists who are listening at home, what would you say are your most, let's say, daily frustrations as an artist, and what are your more sort of long-term frustrations as an artist, and how do you get over them?
I mean, I think the kind of, just the day-to-day nuisances of kind of modern life get in the way, actually. And I'm very much an artist that kind of likes quite a sort of monastic sort of setup in the way that I work. So I like to be able to pull the door closed behind me and just be in my own space as a maker and be with my own thoughts. And that's one of the beauties also of kind of going on to various residency programs that, I've done in the past, that you do have that kind of moment of consolidated engagement with the work. But yeah, I mean, for sure. The pandemic getting in the way has been a sort of epic disruption. So there's a lot of things kind of spinning around and peripheral just to kind of keeping one's practice going that are, inevitably a kind of hindrance. But I'm also aware that, artists are quite pragmatic individuals. I mean, I think they have to be, to look at all sort of a number of alternatives to be able to kind of feed into one's practice, and you have to keep your eye on the ball. I'm not a romantic in that sense that I would kind of perhaps love to spend every single waking moment 24/7 kind of working on working on my practice. I mean, it takes an enormous amount of energy and commitment and money to keep all of this going. So, as I say, I do have a number of peripheral activities which kind of feed into enabling that to happen.
Well, hearing that, I can see why Paul Nash down the end of the room, 12 years in the making.
It brings into tight focus. This kind of idea about time-based media and the idea that painting somehow is never referred to as time-based media. And actually, the reverse is true, I think. Making paintings can often take years. And Paul Nash's painting Winter Sea is a sort of prime example of that. And something that had obviously been... he'd been ruminating on making it for a number of years and occurred within this interwar period and becomes the forerunner for his great masterpiece, Totus Mea. I mean, I think the visual language of that is all laid down in Winter Sea.
Well, I guess because Piers, you're also the same in that work takes you, if this is fair to say, it takes you a while to complete as well. And if Julian, you also feel the same, that sometimes it can take that time, and with Paul Nash's influence of 12 years in the making, how do you know that you need to keep coming back to it? Obviously, there's the idea that it's not finished.
Yeah,
I've not finished it yet visually, but
yeah.
Is there, like for me, for example, if I was to paint or draw something, I'd get to a point I'd be like, do you know what? I'm done. I can't take this any further. But as two people that are much more skilled and embedded in their sort of their life, there must be something when you're looking at it going, okay, I'm going to have to put the paintbrush down or the pen down. I've got to come back to it. What do you think on that?
I mean, I want to know if you're sitting there in your studio swearing at yourself and your work.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, often, and one of the questions I'm often asked is, how long do these things take to make? And it's a kind of, it's a very, very difficult question to kind of definitively answer, actually. And what tends to happen is I'll work on. I've kind of already made a decision to make a body of work rather than one singular image. And I'll have a campaign when I start the paintings. For example, I'll have a campaign on a painting, set it aside, move that campaign onto another canvas, and I'll just keep this kind of sense of rotation going on in the studio. And it's that coming back to that kind of idea of metabolizing the image. It's, images go through a lot of a lot of transformational kind of processes, really. I mean, when I began, a lot of the paintings that we're surrounded by right now, there were a lot of false starts, which kind of possibly took, possibly I was embedded in the thing for a number of years before I had a major rethink about what I was doing and trying to kind of find a new visual language for rendering the high Arctic and my place within all of that, how I slotted into that. And so yeah, there are a lot of false starts and re-evaluations and trying to sort of swipe aside certain kind of imagistic cliches.
Okay.
And
could you explain what those would be?
Well, I mean, often, having travelled around sort of fairly extensively in the Arctic, I know a lot about polar painting and polar photography, and I was just looking for I'm fairly well versed in all of that, and I love it, and I look at it constantly. I'm just looking for a slightly new prospectus on it all. And as I got more embedded in the project, the thing that really began to appeal to me more than anything was this kind of emerging human story that that is becoming a big kind of issue in the Arctic, and it's a kind of story that's rarely confronted and taken on, I think. And does that make sense? I think that became a kind of ultimately became a major sort of driving force, and that's one of the reasons why I started the portraits.
So when you say human, are you thinking about a human impact on the location and the location's impact on us as humans?
I think I'm thinking about both of those things, Piers. Actually, I mean, there is, you know, within the 15 years that I've been travelling up on the high Arctic, there have been a noticeable number of quite worrying, disconcerting changes, and of course the big one is a major sense of ice loss that is happening, and it's happening. Sure. It is happening at exponential speed. But I have to qualify that really by saying that 15 years ago, I didn't come into conceiving this project through it being driven by, you know, a kind of sense of climate change, or what was then called global warming. In fact, I can remember being up in Fairbanks, up in Alaska, 25 years ago, and noticing that, you know, scattered around town, parts of which still seemed like a very frontier, a remnant of the frontier, that some of these old buildings were collapsing on the permafrost. And so I definitely had an awareness all was not well, but I'm not sure that the issues of climate change were not. I don't think they're kind of. I didn't come into the work with that overt message.
For sure. I think that would be understandable for a lot of people, in the sense that it's very much a bigger picture now for a lot of people, that it's much more in the news consistently, rather than like for me, and I'm sure for you as well, Piers. Back in school, you hear about greenhouse gases, and it was more about the ozone layer back in the day.
Yeah.
But now it's become much more in the forefront for a lot of people. And 25 years ago, 10 years ago, it was a thing, but it's only now that we're aware of, well, it's more documented what it's doing to the planet.
Of course.
The scientific research is there to back it up. We just need the bloody people to actually acknowledge it, that have the power to make the change.
So I'd love to sort of say that everybody should visit the Arctic, because, you know, it's I'll have an experience of it in some way, because I think only by doing that, there will be this very direct sense of realization that actually all is not well. And ice loss is beginning to affect communities in this very profound way.
Yeah,
wow. This is what I think is quite interesting about your exhibition, in that you can come here and you can experience your work quite subtly dealing with global issues, but like the line "all is not well," in terms of things melting, disappearing, loss. This exhibition seems to talk about global issues, but it can also be read, I think, as on a very human, deeply personal level. I think all is not well. Things disappear, things melt, things change.
Yeah. I mean, I think that word that you use there, Piers, that, you know, the sense of loss has, you know, it's a very appropriate word actually, from a kind of, you know, in a macro and a micro kind of sense. You know, one that describes not only the environment but you know, I've kind of found myself in, but one that's perhaps, you know, deeply personal. And what I didn't want to do with this body of work was say to the viewer, well, this is, the work has been contrived in this sense to make you look at what I'm describing in a very particular or specific kind of way. I don't want to, I don't want to tell the viewer what he or she should.
I don't think you do that at all. I don't think this work is over-prescribed at all. I think it is powerful enough and quiet enough and intelligent enough to allow somebody else to, project what they want onto it, into it, and receive what they want from it. It is as quiet as I imagine that landscape is, and I'm sure it gets loud sometimes too with like Arctic winds.
Certainly does.
But I think, and you're a visual artist who, of course, speaks with language, writes in language, but your primary form of expression is visual language, and the silences that we have to meet when looking at your paintings, that's where language fails us. And I think you get that impression that is more quiet and surreal and slightly magical and slightly strange, and it isn't shouting something back at us with one clear sentence.
That's great. I mean, those perceptions. I mean, it's. I guess ultimately it's a kind of meditation. It's a kind of meditation on the here and now, and perhaps we can talk about the portraits a little later on, maybe. But they begin to perhaps start to contain something imagistically that's a slightly unnerving.
These are the portraits, particularly.
Yeah.
I would agree. I think whenever you capture a portrait, you admire and are also filled with concern for the thoughts in that portrait, because there's a person there, and there's a you making the portrait, and there's a them sitting for the portrait, and then everything that they bring and you bring and what brought you together. I think there is something unsettling about that. I don't think any portrait in the history of art is settled, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Oh God, this one's looking at me. Oh God, it's following me around the room now. Talking of the people, and we've talked a little bit about the landscape itself, I wanted to take us on to the next question, Julian.
Sure. Yeah.
I can only assume that the two are entwined together. Mm-hmm. The high Arctic is vast and isolated, as we can see from the paintings around us. But what drew you to it, and how has that place influenced your work and the method that you use?
I mean, in a way, I kind of guess that begs the question: isolated from what and from whom? I mean, I think the isolated is. The word isolated is very much sort of human construct of sorts. I mean, the high Arctic contains a large number of indigenous communities, and all of those communities are, they're all fantastically networked primarily through the ICC, which is the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and the Inuit Circumpolar Council are a very politically proactive organisation, and they lobby, particularly with regards to Greenland. They are constantly lobbying the government in Denmark, and there is this kind of, as time goes on, there is this progressive sense of self-determination and self-government that is progressively gaining kind of purchase and traction. But I mean, the Antarctic is a different kettle of fish, isn't it? That certainly is isolated.
For sure.
And anybody who's had to cross the Drake's Passage or the Southern Ocean will testify to that. And I think that's, that kind of sense of isolation is a fantastic thing, actually. And the more that can remain isolated and become this kind of quasi sort of laboratory of sorts, I think, the better for us all. But I think that kind of exposure to the high Arctic has absolutely fundamentally reshaped what I thought I was and what I thought about my art practice, and perhaps ask the question, how close to the dark side is one prepared to go? I mean, this is quite a kind of melancholic meditation on the high Arctic, a kind of psychologizing of place, and hopefully touches upon something that's elegiac. It's a melancholic meditation on the Arctic personality itself, I guess, and the very idea of human interiority, albeit an absolute, informed by its absolute opposite, which is a kind of unparalleled sort of immensity. The far north as a state of mind, the physical north standing as a counterpart for the conceptual north. I think it's very difficult for anybody, I would imagine, to go into a place like that and come away feeling
the same
person. It's impossible to remain untouched by it, I think. And one of the things that became immediately apparent to me was a kind of kinship between the ice and the activity of painting itself. Ice is constantly in a state of flux, rebuilding itself and moving between transparent and opaque, liquid and solid, saturated hues and monochrome states, much like the properties of painting itself. So I really wanted the paintings to have this sense of kind of remoteness, if that makes sense, and begin at a distance before collapsing in spatially and closing in on the imagination. So there's a certain spatial depth there before the eye returns to the surface of the paintings and perhaps begins to question why the artist is doing this and that with the physical properties of the medium itself. But I also wanted to create a kind of screen of sorts, which kind of tags on to something we were perhaps talking about earlier, a screen upon which the viewer might project his or her own thoughts and perhaps begin to process the depiction or rendering of a world which looks somehow out of time, or out of touching distance. And this otherworldliness is, of course, informed by place, and this place has become a kind of litmus for the future. I mean, truly, I've had all kinds of feedback from Frankenstein to proxy self-portrait, all of which are right and accurate perceptions, I think. But you're absolutely wrong. I get the thrust of the question. The high Arctic is vast and isolated to an extent. Although we might be more. It might be more connected to us than one possibly might imagine. But what it also is it's now it's far from a terra nullius. I mean, these lands are brimming with people. They have their own indigenous populations, and they are brimming with spirits and ancestors. And perhaps it's worth a bit of a mention there about the Titanic, because we're in Southampton. Talking about a bunch of work that is informed by the Arctic, and of course the Titanic was regretfully sunk by an iceberg that was actually carved from the glacier, which is just up the coast from this particular location where I've spent a lot of time, and the portraits were using the ice from that glacier. And it's still a kind of frontier of sorts, given where we're at, with technological and a kind of industrial expansionism and a kind of frontier. upon which the future is panning out at a kind of exponential speed. So, the high Arctic is a zone poised on the threshold of rapid and dramatic changes, and many of those changes, as we've said, are kind of factors being driven by ice loss. So important, kind of importantly for me as an artist, it's also a territory. It's a territory like painting of the human mind and artistic imagination. And maybe it's a good point to actually just sort of sidestep for a little bit and talk about the portraits.
Yeah, please do.
And look specifically at that as an example. I'd wanted to make them for a number of years, and it took me some time to conceptually figure it out, really, trying to find a kind of visual language that would echo what was happening socially, at least in my own imagination, and begin to look at a human story of the far north. And of course, many of those profound social changes are being driven by ice loss. So it was important to me that there were two very distinct characters in this work: the individuals themselves that I'm drawing, and the signatures of the ice itself as it interacts and dissolves and erases the drawings. So I hope that the drawings form this very direct correlation to the surrounding ice sheet.
I would say so, because even just then I was going to say, as someone that is more inclined to photography myself,
Yeah.
and photography being part of the exhibition, a lot of people would hear, oh, I did some portraits. I've used photography. I'll just take a picture of these people in their environment. But the fact that you've mentioned there that you've actually used the ice from the environment itself, that you would never be able to do that with photography unless you were doing some sort of darkroom wizardry with melted ice caps in the solution or something. I don't know, but it wouldn't necessarily have the same effect that it does.
Ice alchemy.
I'm getting a bit of a wizard vibe off you, Julian.
You are certainly, and I think alchemist is, I think you should be called artist/alchemist, because when you look at the charcoal work and you consider that ice has dissolved these, they can be quite inconceivable. And I have often wondered, hold on, how has this guy even done this? Like, they're so strange. And so how would you ever reproduce something like that? I think when I look through portraits in history, I don't think, oh, there's a clear method here. I can see that this is influenced by X, Y, Z. This seems very, to sort of use your point, it's right at the north of a new frontier.
Well, there's a bit of a backstory as well to all of this that perhaps might be sort of a good occasion to mention. And actually, it goes way, way back to when I was a student. And I'd gone to see an exhibition in Paris at the Pompidou Centre of minimalist painting, and which was a kind of astonishing, for somebody in their formative years, was a kind of astonishing, profoundly kind of impactful exhibition. And I loved it. I still think about it a lot, actually. But lurking very discreetly over in a corner was what I thought initially, having clocked it from a distance, was this blank piece of paper.
Who's put this up?
It was a whole bunch of mischief, actually, and it was a collaborative piece made by Robert Rauschenberg and Willem de Kooning. And Robert Rauschenberg had asked Willem de Kooning whether he could take one of his drawings and erase it.
Oh, wow, okay. So I'm not familiar with these two people. Is one of those someone that did something with pencil?
Well, they were both very active during the 50s and 60s and into the 70s during what became known as abstract expressionist, the abstract expressionist period. So Rauschenberg had asked de Kooning whether he could take one of his drawings and erase it, and de Kooning had said to him, well, I'll play ball, I'll let you do it, but I'm going to make it phenomenally complex for you to erase, and which he did. So there was this highly what apparently was this highly complex mixed media drawing, which the story goes that Rauschenberg then spent the following months trying to forensically kind of erase this drawing. So what you're left with are a whole kind of bunch of residual ghosted kind of marks where Rauschenberg's, he's deployed a whole number of sort of solvents and so on to erase this drawing. And this absolutely got its hooks into me, and the kind of mischief of it got its kind of hooks into me as well. So in a way, this is a bit of a throwback, a sort of imaginative sort of throwback to the memory of all of that. Mm-hmm. And when I was conceiving of the project and making these drawings, one of the things that I had decided to do from the outset was create the drawings in two very distinct but interrelated phases. So you'd have this first phase with the sitter, and these very forensically rendered drawings, which was a huge time commitment, not only from myself but from my sitters as well. And as this work progressed, there would be the intervention of this kind of second phase, which is where the ice would begin to dissolve and erase the drawings. And I thought, well, come the day, if it ever comes, when I can sequentially, I can hang this body of work as a kind of unbroken, continuous line of images, that it would transition from dark to light to disappearing completely. So you'd have this kind of, you'd almost have like this tonal step wedge on the wall. And yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I got to a point where it was a kind of, COVID kind of got in the way, and back to Denmark I had to get. So it was kind of abruptly interrupted as a sequence or series of works. And it's definitely something that I'm going to return to. It's not a complete body of work by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. It is just the beginning.
You scratch the surface.
Scratch the surface.
With the ice, are you using it as a physical drawing tool, or are you laying ice on top of the drawing and letting it then dissolve the drawing? I want to know, are you manipulating the ice, or does the ice do its thing?
Great question.
Yes, a good question. I had thought about crafting these ice ice pencils, which
we'll patent them,
and that would have been something that would have been actually fairly straightforward to have done. And I think, had I had more time with that project, that may have occurred. But I did get to a point where I would just wander off with an ice axe actually, and splinter off shards of ice from kind of beached icebergs that were easy for me to get to.
A beached iceberg? I've never even considered an iceberg being beached, considering they're in the water.
Well, I mean, they do frequently, and certainly if one's without a huge kind of expanse of sea ice that you can walk on, that's kind of probably all that's sort of really left to you, is get to a beached iceberg and take off splinters of ice. And it's extraordinary just how, one has to remember how much water is actually tied up inside these icebergs, because the ice has been compressed for thousands of years inside a glacier before the iceberg becomes carved. The drawings are also very kind of experimental in that sense, that until I started using the ice and actually seeing how the ice was interacting with the drawn elements of the work, I was kind of not really sure how that was going to pan out from a process perspective. So
were you testing ice with charcoal, ice with pencil, ice with crayon, ice
purely with charcoal.
Just with
Luke,
charcoal,
yeah.
okay.
I had to have a medium that I knew was dissolvable.
Oh, sure, okay. Yeah.
Potentially you get to the last one of the sequence on the far left as we look at them, which was actually the second drawing I made of this particular individual. You get to a point where you can just begin to see that sense of erasing and dissolving kind of beginning to take over, perhaps.
Yeah. So going back to what Piers was saying, is it like just a clump that you rub on the top, or?
I wouldn't rub away at anything. I would just leave it. I started off kind of very sort of strategically placing shards of ice which were of a certain size, and just allowing the visual noise that would build up from that just kind of do their own thing, really. So it would be as much that phase of the work would be as undetermined in terms of the eventual visual manifestation of it would be as undetermined as possible.
I imagine the paper itself has to be quite robust too to deal with this.
The paper is fantastically robust, and it's actually a paper I've kind of worked obsessively on for probably 25 years, actually. It took me
I'll be
a
getting
while.
that when we finish.
Tell
me what that is.
It took me a while to find it, Piers, actually, and
Because it's so durable, it survives.
well, it loops right the way back to biomarkers, actually, in the work I made at the Banff Centre 25 years ago. And I knew that it had a particular kind of surface and a particular kind of robustness that would take the intervention of a high degree of moisture.
The idea of you going around getting ice from the ice sheets, it just reminds me of Wallace and Gromit, A Grand Day Out, where he goes to the moon for cheese, and he's just walking around chopping off bits of cheese for his crackers. Your images of the crackers and the icebergs of the moon.
I had a kind of extraordinary afternoon when I was in a small museum way up on the kind of the northwest coast of Greenland, doing one of my residencies, and the museum. This was actually over the winter period, and the museum would be closed for three or four days a week. Clearly there weren't a lot of museum goers in town at that particular time, but Ola Gamps-Pedersen, who was the museum director, he came into the office one day and he said to me, do you fancy a walk out onto the ice? I need to go and collect some ice to make some tea with.
Cool.
So having maybe a scotch kind of in the back of my mind here, scotch on the rocks. So I went off with Ola, and we went out on this kind of hike onto the sea ice, and crazily, we both should have known better. At this particular point, we both caught frostbite.
Oh no, really?
Ola had it kind of, parts of his face, and I was taking a number of photographs and promptly caught frostbite on my hand. But we were chipping off these shards of ice for Ola's tea and my whiskey later on. And
As it was chipping bits of you off as well.
It was chipping bits of me off, and ice that eventually got recycled, well, so to speak, into using on these drawings.
Wow.
So quite an eventful afternoon, and that the two of us kind of catching frostbite, and just anecdotally fed into to the two slightly larger portraits in Gallery 1, and also they began life in this very kind of simple. Very simple kind of direct way, with me making compressed snowballs from just gathering up snow and compacting the snow that would have been full of dog piss and bits of blood and shit and what have you, which was kind of, you're kind of walking over this stuff all the time. So I'd make these very compacted snowballs, and that's how the drawings began. The snowballs would melt and dissolve, and the sort of hot spots, so to speak, where all those kind of juicy ingredients kind of collected into one spot.
Juicy ingredients, what a way to describe them.
Would that kind of the center, if you like, of that visual noise became the location to locate the portraits.
Not necessarily the juicy snowballs that you're talking about, but the ice itself. Any particular flavour to it? Did you try it?
Great taste.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. I mean, could you think better than having a kind of 1,000-year-old chunk of ice in your whiskey soda?
Cool. Yeah, I like that a lot.
That once existed inside an iceberg. It's the purity of it is just astonishing.
Yeah. Incredible.
No, I mean the idea was to plant this for the viewer, somehow hoping that it wouldn't, with regards to the portraits, just wouldn't become this kind of sort of portentous bunch of faded names on a tombstone of the possible future.
If you have for us to go on to our third question, Julian.
Sure.
If your imagery in your work is the tip of the iceberg, if you like, what are the concepts that lie beneath?
Well, the tip of the iceberg. I'm enjoying your pun.
We tried very hard on that one.
We were sat there thinking, oh, God.
We looked at each other and went, yes, that's it. He's going to love that.
How long did it take you to come up with that?
Too long.
About as long as Paul Nash.
But they say that, they do say that up to 90% of an iceberg's mass is lying below the surface. And I do think that one could apply, you could apply that to, apply that to the work in a way. I mean, there's a vast amount of research and development that takes place in the formation of this work. And most of it of absolutely no interest, I'm sure, to anybody but myself.
Oh, we're interested, Julian, I can tell you that.
And that 10% that becomes visible above the surface, if you like, becomes the visible artwork after vast amounts of distillation. I mean, let's take biomarkers, for example. If we look at that, I wanted to make a bestiary of my own after reading Stephen Jay Gould's book, Wonderful Life and the Nature of History, way back in 1989. But a bestiary not necessarily in the classic medieval sense of it, of kind of imagined creatures, but a bestiary which chimed with my interest in classification and taxonomy and my interest in catastrophe. So all of that kind of research and development was very much based upon empirical data. So after reading that book and allowing the idea to steep in my imagination, 10 years later, I went off to the Banff Centre for the Arts in Alberta, Canada. And whilst I was on that residency, I hopped over the border into British Columbia and climbed up to the now famous Walcott Quarry, tucked right under the summit of a mountain. So you've got this weird sort of thought of this old ancient 510 million year old seabed right under the summit of a mountain. So there's been this over millennia. There's been this kind of enormous geological upheaval. So that seabed, that fossilized seabed, now contains the Burgess Shale fossils, fossils which Stephen Jay Gould referred to in his book as the holy ones, and I think he referred to that. He used that specific phrase because they begin to tell us what life was like 510 million years ago, and how that life became completely discontinued, and a linear idea of evolution disrupted through Earth's first major global extinction event. So this is a bestiary of drawings that that was initially, based upon empirical data, but not a bunch of purely literal drawings which illustrated fossils. They took the often strange and weird body plans of the flora and fauna and deconstructed it and subsequently rebuilt it and reshaped it through the human imagination. They very much became fossils. Drawings very much became fossils of their own making, in a sense, and they're really kind of ground into being. And I one of the things that I immediately became aware of was their visual potential for me as an artist. So I stopped painting. I stopped painting for about 4 or 5 years and made 3 subsequent trips back to the Banff Centre, largely thanks to the Arts Council of England. And whilst I was making biomarkers, whilst all of that was in progress, I was slowly beginning to conceive of a large project which would sort of zoom out and begin to look at various aspects of the far north and the high Arctic. And so where we're at now, Arctic Mirage, this exhibition forms the very first part of that project. So I guess it's important to say that this exhibition is in no way the conclusion to anything, and actually it's just a beginning. But hopefully you begin to build a picture by all of this of just how important to me the research and development aspects are, and begin to build a bit of an insight into the concepts, as you put it, that lie below the surface. These projects can often have these kind of massively vast trajectories and take me a number of years to realise. And all of this research and development, it sort of brings out the nerd in me, I guess. And the Arctic work is very similar in that it took a while for that project to gain a certain kind of purchase and traction, accompanied by a bunch of false starts, and until those failures begin to kind of stack up, and out of that there becomes this kind of creative renewal of sorts. And I began to sort of see things with a bit more clarity, as the great Samuel Beckett once said: "Try again, fail again, and fail better." If you're going to take something on like this, it has to be informed by a truly immersive experience, for me personally, and that's what it's been over the years, I think.
Well, Julian.
Yeah.
Thank you for answering our questions. I mean, for the sheer fact that we've got time limits on us today, I feel like there's so much more that
Indeed.
we want to discuss and would like to discuss. Who knows? Maybe there'll be a Julian part 2 when we see a biomarker show. Maybe I'd love to see the 100 in a room.
Yeah.
Like genuinely, for anyone that hasn't come down yet and will come down as a result of this, I can see that biomarkers has a very special place. Just seeing you talk about it.
I think it does, and I think actually it is one of the most important, just in terms of my own history and my own development as an artist. It's possibly one of the most important bodies of work that I've made.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you say you're like nerding out a little bit.
Yeah.
Lean into it, Julian. Like the stuff in that room, the fossils, the meteorite, sort of like powder and stuff.
Yeah.
It is cool. It is. And I think that's fine. I think for a lot of people that come into galleries, they're like, oh God, I should be expecting this really cerebral, I need to know exactly what they're talking about and this, that and the other. But I'm from Southampton. I can probably speak for a fair number of people in the general public in that we're not these like highbrow, I'm a massive art intellectual. I'm one of these people that like, I come in, the surface level is, oh, that's sick. That's really cool to.
I think that's one of the things that I'm constantly trying to get across. Actually, that in the end, these are drawings and they're paintings, and they have a certain physicality to them.
Yeah,
and that physicality has, they've taken a lot of. It's taken a lot of experimentation and choices, apposite choices, material choices to get to where I am, and I'm constantly trying to return the viewer to the surface of the work and announce these things as physically made objects.
Well, this might be a very interesting segue, because perhaps it's a good time now to hear your questions for us as
definitely. Very nice.
visitors of the experience.
Sure,
what
love
would you like?
to.
Yeah,
Absolutely
we're
love
excited.
So, Piers and Lou, what I'm interested to hear about is your very first thoughts when you initially encountered the exhibition.
I was impressed by the quantity and quality of both work and material. And I think my unfamiliarity with the high Arctic influenced how I engaged with your exhibition. And for me, the landscapes that I saw throughout your show were not real spaces, but imagined ones. I saw the edges of your works on paper and canvas as containers for an internal landscape, sort of something internally, something internal made manageable. That's sort of how I saw it. And personally, I was immediately inspired, which led to a few fantasies about your process and application. I think what inspired me was how, by looking at your work, I could tell that years and years had gone into trying to depict a subject that is almost impossible to capture, like the falling snow or the slush of ice. And I at once could understand something of how you made your work, but at the same time was totally confused, asking myself, oh my gosh, how did this happen? And I found your process as elusive as your subject. I think this exhibition will inspire a lot of artists. It's an exhibition that sort of says, here is an artist that has found a deeply individual way of using materials to make pictures. And I think people will understand or come to realise that by viewing your method, imagining your process, your work will inspire the possibility for a method for another to use. So your work cannot be replicated, but its ambition can. And I think that's what's so inspiring.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I mean, something that I always return to, actually, is something that a great British filmmaker, David Lean, once said, which is that all engaging art, all interesting art must have a touch of unreality about it. I think that's so true. In whatever form the artist or the maker is working in, I think it's a kind of mantra that I hold very dear, because this is reality. We're surrounded by reality, but that reality has to be taken and transformed, and it's that transformation that artists, I think, are interested in. It's certainly what I'm interested in. Trying to find a visual language subtle enough to carry the sort of sedimentation of these different kind of meanings and ideas.
Yeah, fantasy, reality seems to be something you can manipulate through fantasy, paradoxically. So, I think that's very true of this show and what people do in their, or what successful artists do in their work wholeheartedly.
I mean, I think also, Piers, there's this kind of this kind of notion behind all of this, which is, how does one become exposed to this overwhelming sense of vastness, which is truly diminishing on a human scale? And how do you go about processing that as an artist and collapsing that into manageable form?
Do you know what resonated with me also was, personally, I have sort of a disposition for empty spaces, and I've never quite understood why I like being in a space totally alone and being in a vast space totally alone. And like I look at these paintings and these drawings, these photographs, and for me, the sort of closest real experience that I've had would be either in my local area or, funny enough, in Cornwall, on like Bodmin Moor, and it is strange and magical just how much visiting various places will have an effect on you and sort of lingers with you. And then what do you do with that unconscious bubbling that sort of keeps you up at night? And perhaps we are haunted by that, or we do something with it.
Is it a certain characteristic of those places that keeps you up at night, or you remember for your work? Or
I think, sort of along with you, I just think there's something deeply. They affect one on a psychological level, and
I can imagine that. I mean, there's also, absolutely imagine that. There's also this kind of idea of how, in terms of how one goes about processing space, physical space and scale. And certainly from my own perspective, was thinking very much about how can I locate an image right on the threshold of it being imagistic before it kind of snaps somehow or tips over into something that's tips over into a space that becomes something else. It's something that is somehow out of human scale. I mean, we're left with, we've got certain parameters, physical parameters in the end that we all have to kind of deal with in terms of making art, and those can often be a fantastic hindrance, and we have to sort of find out how to process scale.
Yeah, mate, what do you think?
my first thoughts when we came into the room, multiple rooms. So myself and Piers were here on your PV.
Yeah.
A special night. Let me turn around so I can see the whole room. My first thoughts were, how the bloody hell have you done it all? Is this actually 3 different people? Because you've got drawing, painting, photography. Yeah. And I think a lot of the time people go to an art exhibition and then you get one art form from the artist, and that's it. Yeah. You might get a little bit of something else, but in this case, there's a substantial body of work for each medium, and I think that's enjoyable for visitors and myself to experience, because then you see, I don't know, you clearly get a level of work that's different in each one. So, for example, the paintings are complete, edge to edge, corner to corner with paint, but then the drawings are not so. They've got spaces that you consider blank, quote unquote blank, if you like, because it's not got charcoal on it. And then you've got your photographs. I think for me, and I think we'll get into this in just a second, that the photography I was, strangely enough, less engaged with. Right. And I don't want this to be an insult to you, Julian, because obviously the work is very powerful, and I will come back to this and it will come full circle in just a moment. But I was less interested in the photography, I think, because the other work, I don't know, it almost feels like it's captured it more real than a photograph has. And I don't really know how to describe that feeling, considering I'm so used to just looking through the lens. Sure. Bang. Yeah. That's what reality is, if you like. Yeah. But then I'm looking at this image here with the 2 icebergs, and I'm like, that makes me feel the space far more than what a picture of that same iceberg would do. And I as someone that's not really I'm not really a painter. I'm not a painter. I would crumble. I can barely follow Bob Ross when we've done that in the past. So the thought of trying to do something like this is equally as scary. But I don't know, man. You've done something, and I don't know if it's to do with the texture on the canvas, because
perhaps it's something to do with. Perhaps it's something to do with what David Hockney referred to as, with regards to photography, as it being thinner. I think he said
Okay.
it was thinner as a process. In other words, it doesn't have the sedimentation of time and thought that perhaps drawing and painting share. But for me, I mean, I've always worked across these three forms, and certainly traveling around the Arctic, when, you know, if you're out on locations that, you know, you've got -20 or -30, obviously there are certain pragmatic issues that kind of come hand in hand with that, about making
no on plein air painting, I imagine.
no plein air painting, or very little of it. I certainly, actually, you know, I may have begun certain drawings up there, but I mean, there's only so long one can kind of physically sort of survive.
You might get frostbite again.
Exactly. So the kind of camera becomes this kind of chronicler of,
For sure.
parts of the journey, in a sense. And of course, the environment that one's in is so transient, so ephemeral, and is kind of moving around constantly, not only in terms of the ice, but the light as well, of course. That a camera loans itself the mechanism of a camera loans itself superbly well to that.
Yeah, definitely.
But I have to probably, you know, sort of qualify again, Luke, that I wouldn't take a photograph. I'll be absolutely in raptures about something which I might photograph, but it probably won't lead on to, it won't inform necessarily a drawing or a painting. And actually, to be honest with you, it's kind of the idea that getting into a dark room is kind of virtually an impossibility now, because that's a kind of also a physical part of the making of an image, is a big frustration. That actually so much of this is happening digitally now.
Yeah, sure.
Don't get me wrong, I love certain aspects of digital cameras.
It's just not the same as an actual analog darkroom processing and developing.
If you were to look at some of the early photographers of the Antarctic, for example, 100 years ago, like Herbert Ponting or Frank Hurley, I mean, those images, those photographic images, still stack up today. They still look as dense and as rich as they ever were.
Do you think that's because of the process that they're using, in the sense that they were using probably maybe like collodion or the large format cameras? There is a characteristic to those images. And as someone that uses film primarily myself.
Do you? Okay.
And I see this on Instagram and everything on social media. People, they put film photography on a picture. But I am well aware that you're using a digital camera. Yeah. Just because you've applied grain to it doesn't mean that it's now some elevated image, because I've given it a film look.
Sure.
It's not film, it's digital. Let's not beat around the bush. But these images that are on film and are on large format, whether it's a sheet of glass or a sheet of metal, they're in the same way that in some of your images, there's sort of like this, what's the word? Like speckling. Like, you know, you see these highlights in the clouds. You almost get those sort of nuances in the film, the photographic film on the top. Like my sister, she went through a phase of using collodion, which is like a silver nitrate, and then you expose it to UV light, or she was far more knowing on it than I am, but it would have those sort of movements of the chemical on the sheet. So you sort of have that similar thing of it's not the same every time.
Yeah, see, I love all of that. You
don't get that now.
No, you don't get that now. It's a kind of purged, cleansed, immaculate kind of shot through Photoshop or processed through Photoshop. And however, you know, it is photographing in the Arctic or the Antarctic is fraught with a whole bunch of
I can only imagine
accompanying issues. Certainly, if you were with what we might refer to as an analog camera, something that contained film at -20, -30, all of that film would be prone to sort of distressing and cracking, and its own raft of problems. So there are, as I say, there are kind of aspects of digital photography that I love, but I think Hockney was his progressive, what sounds like a kind of progressive disengagement or reliance on photography and that description of it as being thinner is I get it completely, absolutely get it completely. It's not that one needs that kind of sedimentation of time and commitment that drawing and painting demand necessarily, but it's a kind of element. It's the question of time, isn't it? I guess the physical properties of time itself.
And I guess it's also just thinking, having been to Cornwall and taken a disposable camera when I got the film back, there was hair on the lens or in the film itself, and that shows up. So it is a material that, like art, it grabs the location around it, whereas digital, I would assume, doesn't have that quality. So yeah, film is a physical thing that latches on to where you are. It's a very human felt physical thing.
Yeah. I mean, I'd gone up there years ago, up to the Arctic years ago, with a kind of intent of making a bunch of pinhole photographs while I was up there.
Oh yeah, nice.
And that kind of the whole interaction of the frosting, potential frosting or freezing of film would somehow, kind of layer itself imagistically into the work, and I still might do that at some point.
Yeah. Because I wonder if that would maybe affect because film is in layers of colour. I wonder if it would affect certain layers maybe more so than others, and then who knows what that would even look like. Oh, yeah, that would be cool. God, why is it so bloody expensive? Because then you think, I could do that, I could have a little go. But unless you've got all this money behind you just can't do it. I'm very conscious of time, Julian. So are we happy to go on to question 2? If that's all right?
Yeah, sure. So question 2. So I'll ask you both what your final thoughts are as the exhibition draws to a close, and has anything changed in your perception of it at all? And if so, how?
Okay, so you will have remembered from moments ago that I mentioned photography was not on the top of my list of things that I was looking at when I came into the show. And upon returning this week and last week, the photography is... We were trying to talk about this, weren't we, Piers? Because I was trying to figure out how I couldn't explain what I was thinking, but it was sort of like I see the photography as much more of a tool for the rest of the body of work. Because clearly, as anyone that's taken a photograph knows, you don't spend a huge amount of time actually physically taking the photograph, because it's a press of a button, click, boom, I've taken the photograph. With the paintings and the drawings, you can see the time. Whether or not you can see all the time, you just know by looking at it, this has taken a lot longer than the photography.
Sure.
And I think by being able to see this documentation of where you were, who you were with, the dogs, the cliff faces, it sort of contextualizes the time that you've spent with the paintings away from that space that you've actually got in the images. Because, I imagine, just to clarify for everyone that's listening, you didn't sit in these Arctic tundras with your paintbrush and palette painting all these images.
Oh, Luke, come on.
Oh, God, you've destroyed the illusion. Holding onto the canvas as it blows away.
No, of course not. And it's one of the things that I've needed from the work as well, actually, is always this kind of sense of physical detachment from source, if that makes sense. And of course, photography doesn't have that, because it's an expression of a fraction, isn't it?
Yeah. Expression of a fraction, I like that. You're talking about shutter speed?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. That's great.
It's been and gone, hasn't it, at the click of a shutter. And often, I think the Arctic kind of loans itself fantastically well to the environment in terms of operating with cameras. I mean, some of the photography, I would have seen it out of the corner of my eye.
For sure.
It's nothing that I could have stopped, paused, and rendered with a pencil. So that kind of immediacy is just one of the wonders of photography.
I think that's just what I sort of appreciated more so on a return, I think, because it's very easy to get sidetracked by what you've got in this room, Julian, because of how, I don't know, awesome in the sense of, wow, oh my God, the sense of awe looking at these landscapes. You can see, yeah, I guess it is just the time element. It's hard to, again, I'm struggling to sort of figure out how to word it again, but
it's a lot to, from the maker's perspective, it's a lot to kind of keep spinning, and to keep focused on, to keep focused, singularly focused on an outcome. It seems like a kind of outcome for any artist is kind of essential. It completes an equation of sorts, doesn't it? And hopefully something about what you're doing resonates with the viewer. Yeah. And everybody picks up and takes away something different. Yeah. So,
and my final comment is, it's nice to see the reality of the environment after spending time with your imagination, if that makes sense.
Sure,
because
absolutely.
There's only so much with photography and Photoshop, sure, but you've not Photoshopped these images. They are a depiction of what was in front of you at the time. And it's almost like a behind the scenes of where you were and who you were with. And that's something that I really enjoyed.
Just anecdotally, Luke, you're sitting right in front of a painting where I set out on the ice on a particularly brutal day. The air was full of ice crystals, the horizon line had disappeared, and it just became this, for me, it just became this incredible, empty, photogenic space.
Wow.
And suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement, and I thought, well, I better turn around and look at what that movement was, just to check out whether I wasn't being pursued by a polar bear. And this guy, this hunter, came out on the ice with his dog team, and it just looked like he was taking off into nowhere. Because the horizon had disappeared, and it just looked like he was going into nowhere and about to take off. And I just thought, well, the visual disruption of that and the kind of spatial disruption was just too good to miss out on. Picked out a small pocket camera, clicked, and everything was kind of like, just luckily, everything was kind of beautifully sort of pin sharp. I just kind of lucked out with that image. And it's one of the very few images that I've taken that has spilled over imagistically into a painting, because it was just such an extraordinary bunch of circumstances.
Yeah. It's that feeling of you've taken the picture and you're like, I've done it. You know it's a good one. Yeah. That feeling, that sort of smile you get. Yeah. Piers, what were your
I guess three things, and they would be, I still think, particularly the painting room, although I'm deeply, deeply interested in sort of the technical application of charcoal in the first room, but the painting room, it's difficult not to well up at some of the iceberg works, because they really are quite sad, I think. For me, I think there's a lot of death in there, and you can meditate on that, but they are fundamentally something exceptional. I've never seen something quite like that, and as you said, like you take from artists, there'll be, including myself, a lot of us will take from you in this exhibition going forward. My other two bits would be, I didn't spend enough time with biomarkers. When I was there last week, my gosh, they are so strange. I cannot wait to see a full exhibition of those. They were, again, Julian is an alchemist. I just couldn't believe, how has this person done it? If you draw, you're a draftsman, you come up to them and you think, oh yeah, I'm going to figure this out. I couldn't figure it out. And then the last thing I'd have to say is, I want a huge coffee table style book with the largest overly detailed reproductions of your work so I can just spill over it. I am desperate for something like that. There is a beautiful publication for this exhibition, which I, of course, would recommend everybody get. But you also want I want an even bigger book. I want a whole retrospective of Julian's early drawings.
Well, who knows, Piers? Maybe one day.
You want life-size replications of the actual canvases?
I completely do. It's again, and then my last point would be: this is an exhibition that I don't really want to say goodbye to.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's I completely agree, Piers. For sure.
Kind. That's so kind of you.
And that's just not us blowing snow up you. That's a genuine.
Okay, I'm overwhelmed. Thank you so much.
I'm very aware of the time. We unfortunately have a certain time pressure on us today, so I'm going to take us on to round 3, which is our iconic bowl. I'm going to bash it for the audience to hear, so they know it's here. These are questions that we've sourced from the general public.
Okay. It's a lucky dip.
It's a lucky dip. Yeah, we'll get through as many as we can. But
rapid fire.
Just get in there, Julian, and see what you get.
Okay, let's have a look at the first one. Vanessa, I'd love to know if you paint your huge landscapes from memory, or do you work by scaling up sketches or photographs? Vanessa, first of all, probably quickly, I'm not a landscape painter, never have been, and I'm not really interested in painting the landscape. I do work from memory. I work from memory quite a bit, but I never scale up sketches or photographs. And as I think we may have touched upon, as important an element of my practice as photographs and drawing is, they very, 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 very rarely inform what I'm doing as a painting. Thank you, Vanessa. Hopefully that's asked.
I think so. There was a bunch of juicy material earlier on that hopefully relates back to that.
Hopefully it does, I think.
Thanks. Oh, here we go.
Florence, how long does it take you to paint one of the big oil paintings? And also, how do you make that turquoise blue colour of the ice caps? So, Florence, that's quite a difficult question to ask. And again, it goes back to maybe a point in our earlier discussion where I would very, very rarely begin and finish a painting. Well, I would never do it. Begin and finish a painting in one session.
Before going on to the next one?
Before going on to the next one. So I've often...
Oh, I like that.
I've often got a large number of works in the studio on the go at any one time, and I will just keep the whole lot kind of circulating and on the move, and I'll perhaps have a thought or an idea emerging from the making of something which might spill over or inform what would happen on another painting. That could be something process driven or something imagistically driven.
And then you'll then and there flip-flop to the next one if you get a sort of spur in...
I do.
Oh, wow, okay, cool.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. How do I make that turquoise?
Is it an industry secret, Julian?
Not really. I mean, as you probably have guessed, I'm not really that interested in colour, and I use colour in this very, very reduced kind of way, really. And I've perhaps chosen the times of year that I go to the Arctic specifically to encounter the environment at its perhaps most monochromatic states. So there's just a kind of thimbleful of colour here and there. The blue in the painting that Florence is referring to, I think, was just, when I saw that blue iceberg, it was absolutely staggering, and I could see it. Over a number of days, and it was degrading quickly on a day-by-day basis.
The actual iceberg?
The actual iceberg, and it was reflecting, of course it's not physically blue, the ice isn't physically blue, it's reflecting back the blue end of the light spectrum. And it was an ancient iceberg, and the bluer the ice becomes, the more oxygen depleted it is.
Oh.
So it's you're looking at highly compressed ice that's been, it's been compressed in the glacier.
And it's just starved of oxygen.
And it's starved of oxygen. So, so it's reflecting back the blue end of the spectrum. How I make it, I mix the colour like any other colour, Florence, and
I'll throw it all in and hope for the best.
Yeah, maybe we should move on from there.
Go for another one.
Eddie, question from Eddie. What made you use dog urine? Spur of the moment, or did you leave your sketchbook on the floor? Good question. Well, I think we've covered it, haven't we? But Eddie, what happened was I will often start work, be it drawings, making drawings or paintings, by creating that kind of initial layer of visual noise, something that's informed or driven or informed by the location and so on, but would be a layer of visual noise that would provide me with the next move. Mm-hmm. And I think the work that Eddie's referring to is potentially one of the portrait drawings, which I would have made with a compressed ball of snow, which contained dog piss.
So it's not specifically that a dog has.
So I didn't say to I didn't encourage a dog over to to a sheet of paper and just say kind of lift your leg on that. It wasn't. It wasn't quite like that. But I would make a compressed ball of snow, and that the melting of that snow would give me that first bit of visual noise.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, I think we've got time for maybe two more.
Ooh.
Go for it.
Hello. All right. Martin asks, what is it about drawing that makes it akin to thought itself? Good question, and I think it is the very direct immediacy of it, and it's a kind of unmediated channel, I think, potentially, to the way one thinks, and it's one's thoughts made manifest. I mean, it's one of the things that I absolutely, I've been a huge fan of Joseph Beuys, for example, for years and years, and Beuys was an artist, again, whose practice was driven by drawing, but it was drawing that was used in this, fantastically inventive, material diverse kind of way, which he would use anything on a drawing, pretty much, if it chimed with or resonated with a thought at the time. So yes, hopefully that answers Martin's question.
Okay, there we go. One more.
So last but not least, Phoebe asks, are there any other locations you would be interested making work about? Well, possibly, Phoebe, and I'm still thinking about moving higher or further north into the Arctic, and there are moves ahead to do that. Yes, I think so. And one of the things that I want to kind of move on to is opening up this idea of looking at architecture, extreme architecture, and looking at buildings of a new frontier, I guess. And that requires kind of going sort of further north still, I think.
And by architecture, do you mean the physical landscape, the structure of the earth? Or
no, I do mean
buildings.
I do mean buildings.
Okay.
And exploring that whole kind of idea of human habitation.
Yeah.
At its absolute limits.
There's a little bit in this show, isn't there? Because Doghouse,
there
you
is.
see, but I wonder more modern if there is such a thing up there. Yeah.
Yeah, there is, and of course, one of the things that became of interest that actually when I was in Svalbard was doing a circumnavigation of Spitsbergen was stopping every so often to see scientific research stations and how all of that was had sort of assembled itself over kind of 100 years pretty much, and how that fusion of the old and new comes together. But yeah, looking at architecture right on the threshold of human existence.
Wow. Ooh, little teaser for everyone of what's to come. Oh, that's going to be so cool. Well, Julian, I think that brings us to an end, but we cannot say thank you enough for joining us today and having us in your space, in your exhibition. So thank you so much.
The pleasure's all mine. It's been an absolute buzz. So,
Julian, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Absolutely welcome.
Thank you very much for listening. If you would like to learn more about the On the Gallery Floor podcast, then please visit jhg.art. And you can also connect with us now on Instagram via the handle @OnTheGalleryFloor.
So please do send us a message if you've got any questions, or, hey, even if you'd like to work with us.
We'll be back for more next time on the Gallery Floor.